Hello there. So then, happy Halloween to everyone, and here we are at the second installment and the final one for our treatment on the witches of Europe. Now, in the first video, we were simply outlining the general anatomy of the witch and indeed the underpinning informers that most likely contributed to the formation of the practice of witchcraft itself. And we concluded that witchcraft was not a direct continuation of the older pagan systems of some people have suggested, but really we should see it as a metamorphosis, a mutation from a family of those older practices that spoke originally to the chthonic gods of the underworld and of nature. And they were practiced outside of the main jurisdiction of the major religious and social centres that were taken over by Christianity. We also concluded that witchcraft was a lower magical system, meaning that its practice was cruder, it was more improvised, and was not part of a higher organised system of philosophy and religious expression like paganism or Christianity. We also asserted that the practice of witchcraft was tied up in the rural activities and festivals, and it was probably seeded with an antagonism and disdain towards the prevailing superstructures at the time. So it had a slightly rebellious nature to it. And in this video, I now want to jump from that understanding and look deeper into the subjects of heresy and the much distorted Inquisition period of medieval Europe's history. I want us to understand the particulars that contributed to the severe reactions of the Christians against these outsider practices in a very mature and sober style of approach. I am neither a pagan nor a Christian, nor certainly a witch, so I haven't really got any skin in the game when it comes to inferring biases into the subject that would distort it and conform it into the image of any prior prejudice that someone might already possess. I want to try and deliver a much needed dose of sobriety and clarity as well over a period in Europe's history that has been so muddied and hyperbolically distorted by all kinds of different interests. And I want us to come away from this with a new understanding, not only of the history, but more importantly of the psychology of hysteria and social scapegoating that lends itself to modern day witch hunts as it did in the ones of the medieval period. Because this is a reoccurring thing that goes on in human history, and it has nothing to do with us being more rational or enlightened than people in the past, because in fact the potential for such patterns to spring up again is wedded into our human capacity for malevolence and is certainly dependent on certain circumstances that we're going to look at through the course of this video. So then, without further ado, let's get on with it. So before we go right in and talk about heresy, I want to very briefly go over some of the reasons why this period in Europe's history has been so confused and distorted, because this really is the shell that we're going to have to crack through in order to get to a position of clarity on this. Much of the writing on the topic of witchcraft has been inconsistent at best and absolute drivel revisionism at worst. The lack of seriousness with which some writers have treated the history of witchcraft is palpable, and this is going to be a much more serious video in tone than the last one, primarily because we're going to be talking about circumstances that led to the deaths of thousands of human lives, and it always speaks to my pessimism when I discover over and over and over again how human beings are not willing to take seriously the consequences of the past and learn from it, and instead look to hijack history for their own present agendas. And this is especially the case with the medieval period that we're going to be looking at here. So let's put all of this into context then. What we learn is that the first major inquiries into witchcraft were compiled before the beginning of the 20th century, so quite a long time had passed after the events that were being analysed. Before then, we have treatments on the subject being made, whilst also being infused with the tastes and the prejudices of the people who wrote for them. For example, in the 18th century, we have rationalist writers who, in their characteristically naive optimism over human nature, underestimates the capacity for human malevolence and self-deception, and insist that the phenomena of witchcraft was purely the invention of prejudiced religious zealots, and it acted as yet another example of the inherent superstition and oppressive nature of the Catholic Church that these rationalists themselves hold in a prejudice. What these humanist liberals fail to realise is not only did the phenomena of witchcraft exist independently of the Church, but the capacity for viciousness and superstition is inherent within all men, and is not merely a byproduct of the overarching religious systems that the rationalists themselves, as I said, frame in their own form of prejudice. Then after we have the rationalist writers, then we get to the Romantic period, and here you get this great resurgence of interest in the occult and seances and the like, where people were trying to access alternative modes of spirituality out of personal disillusionment with Christianity and the rationalist persuasions of the intellectual climate. The pollution that these writers have made, the Romanticists, is that, like the rationalists, they have seeded their own persuasions into the research and try to legitimize witchcraft as a plighted and misunderstood continuation of some noble and ancient wisdom. The reality contains some truth to both of these persuasions by the rationalists and the romantics. The integrity of the study of witchcraft has been plighted, and it's been plighted by revisionist researchers who have moulded the witch and the practice of witchcraft into the image of what they wanted it to be, and then subsequently cast that image out into the world as an artifact of serious, objective, historical truth. It's not until we get into the 20th century when we see a rekindling of interest in human religion, comparative mythology, and human folklore begin to happen. This time applied through the more sophisticated lenses of human psychology and human anthropology by the likes of writers such as James Frazer and Levi Strauss. And we then start to see a much more robust impression of the witch and its surrounding history emerge and counteract much of the distortion that was committed by both the rationalists and the romantics in the earlier periods that we just mentioned. Despite these efforts, though, at a more thorough and mature analysis on witchcraft being made, unfortunately, popular perception has not caught up with it, and our minds are still held under the thrall of romantics and rationalist revisionism. With these two videos, I have wanted to cut through that fog and offer a rendering of the witch that is more in keeping with the sobriety of those more contemporary researchers in the humanities, so that we can begin the process of accessing our own history again with a stronger set of eyes. Alright then, so now that we've put ourselves in the right frame of mind for this, let's now really try to understand this problem of heresy in the medieval world and how it applies to witchcraft. It's quite interesting to me when we look into how various human cultures reconcile themselves to alternative modes of expression that stretch beyond the orthodox system that's in place. There is always going to be an oligarchy of ideas that defines the character of a particular culture, and also a wider body of expression that is tolerated and lives aside the state-sanctioned ideas, or in other cases is deemed forbidden and subject to suppression by the state. And the way that this order is achieved is a negotiation that goes on in every single human society. Magic, which we talked about a bit more in the first video to this, was once considered to be a necessary and integral part of those systems that made up the ancient world. It was considered as a legitimate component of the life sciences, if you will, sitting alongside natural science, philosophy, and the arts. It was what we might refer to as an essential organ within the organism of civilization. It should be said also that the Romans tolerated magic beyond the limits of the officially sanctioned state religion, as long as it did not cause injury to any individual or private or public property. However, with the ascent of Abrahamism in Europe, this greatly altered the perception and the relationship to magic, and alternative spiritual expressions became more and more marginalized throughout time. As I said in the original video to this series, there is nothing to say that the practice of witchcraft had to be for benevolent or malevolent purposes from the position of the individual practitioner. However, in medieval Europe, all practice of witchcraft was considered akin to a criminal line of action. The actual word for dark magic in the medieval period was maleficum. St. Augustine himself qualified the existence of magic to the potency of the fallen angels, who, being cast out of heaven, would travel through the air and shapeshift into many forms to work for the corruption of men who sought out their power through the practice of magic. The way that the Christians saw things was that even though they recognized that an individual might turn to magic out of desperation or some other need that they might on some level be sympathetic to call upon magic, for whatever reason, is to call upon other forces than God and his angels. And because God and the angels are not beholden to the forces of magic within the Christian worldview, the agencies being called upon must, by that reasoning, be demonic in nature. So it doesn't matter whether you were on an individual level well-intended or not, you are still calling upon the aid of powers that are considered under the reigning powers of the day to be evil in nature. And that is what really matters. Not the individual intent, but the origin of the power in question. And therefore, since demons are inherently evil, there cannot be such a thing as good magic. So I think that's something really important to bear in mind so that we can capture the underlying context behind why these practices were so frowned upon by the three theocratic orders of the day. The prevalence of witchcraft increased markedly during the 11th century after the church began a huge rollout plan of cross-national reform and renovation, not just internally, but for all Christian society. The ideal was to create a new society modelled on the Christian order of justice, and this meant a bolstering of the church's influence over the lives of the governed and a clearing out, we could say, of as much suspicious activity that could be realistically isolated and dealt with. And this kind of thing happens quite a lot in human societies when there's a new orthodoxy in the hierarchy of command. There has to be an initial easing in of the order as the system finds its feet and gets its roots into the ground, and then once a strong enough degree of internal stability has been achieved, it attempts to roll out the same manner of stabilization to adjacent parts of the surrounding society. And this was what was actually happening in Europe at the time. One of the consequences of all this, though, was that as the church became purer internally, it also became far more intolerant of expressions within society that it did deem to be impure. And so we have this real and powerful desire emanating from a religious system that genuinely wanted to upgrade itself for the betterment of not just its own house, but also the state of the wider world around it. And this kind of idealism is always a double-edged sword, because in the passion for ascension, humans can very easily descend into the kind of fanaticism that gave rise to the brutal suppression of individuals that were deemed heretical and outside of the accepted boundaries of Christian justice and tolerance. And we can't complete an appreciation of European witchcraft without also understanding something about the changes and the unrest that was going on in Europe's history, because the witch definitely emerges against a backdrop of social unrest, famine, and religious metamorphosis, meaning that we'll have to come to terms with that in order to come to terms with how this phenomena of the witch in Europe's history came about. So as the Catholic Church's drive towards internal purification went on, the very notion that was guiding it produced its own strains of heresy from within the Christian system. Some people who were dissatisfied with the Church's snail-paced progression to bring about the New Jerusalem on earth, and what came out of this was the idea that the kingdom of God was found in the hearts of the saved, and so there was no need for the Pope and priests and even the institution of the Church itself. So the reason that I'm saying this is because the scope of heresy was a much broader had a much broader range to it than dubious outlier activity in the rural fringes of society. It arose also from within the body of Christian society itself, and as this climate of heresy became stronger and stronger, so did the definition of witchcraft and the severity of the means to suppress it. Christian society was changing. It was slowly becoming more integrated, and with that came a burgeoning confidence in the ability of the Church to model society in conformity with its own ideals. But humans are extremely weak creatures, and they fall very easily to hubris and an overconfidence in their own limitations, which often leads to them enabling them to articulate more patterns of suffering from a process that originally advertised itself to act in a healing way for the betterment of society. We always fail to realize that there is a sensitive link between the mind and society. And so changes that are made to the fabric of society will result in changes to the social consciousness of those people who live inside it. And that often causes problematic tensions that then spill over into the expressions of social disquiet and disorder. we also discover that the manner through which patterns of social disquiet are articulated run in accordance with the prevailing cultural zeitgeists of that time. So in other words, we can look at our times today and we can see that this is typically manifested through the expression of social protest and political ideology, whereas in medieval Europe, these expressions of social disquiet were qualified in uniquely religious terms. Sin was considered the viral element that contributed to the breakdown of society, and so the management and the containment, we could say, of sin in society became more pressing on the consciences of those who were in charge of the social order. And this is precisely part of what contributed to the social hysteria around heresy and the attempts to purify society of elements that were perceived as counterintuitive to the pursuit of progress and social justice. Heresy as a crime was initially met with only light punishments because the church was still getting organised and it wasn't so internally secure so as to wage a large-scale rollout of social reform. After it acquired that in itself, though, it began to really up the ante with regards to expanding its reformist policy out into the wider society. And as it did that, the ways that it began to qualify and react to heresy evolved. The Bible was also used as a justification for changes in the law against heresy, such as well as we read in Leviticus 26. I will set my face against the man who wantonly resorts to ghosts and spirits, and I will cut that person off from his people. And also in Exodus 22:18, you shall not allow a witch to live. So here we can see from those two Bible entries that the attitude around outsider practices was beginning to really harden, and so were the styles of acceptable punishment that were to be inflicted upon those found guilty of witchcraft or other heinous crimes. It must be brought back to our attention that a lot of the distortion around this period of European history has been levied by rationalist and romantic writers who have sought to redefine history in their own image. One popular persuasion that often comes up is this idea that the Catholic Church acted like this kind of religious genocidal machine sweeping throughout the countryside and carelessly and enthusiastically snatching up anybody who they thought might be guilty of heresy, and that torture and execution were very frequent occurrences. The reality, however, is a bit more sober and reserved than that. Whilst there were examples of such lynch mob behaviour going on in Europe around this time, the Catholic Church was incredibly restrained in its processing of potential heretics, and they designed a very, very rigorous system for processing those people, because quite simply, they knew that people would try and abuse that system, and so they put in safeguards into it to mitigate any potential abuses. Bring into mind also the religious component to this, whilst punishing an individual found rightly guilty of heresy would have been just in their eyes, to condemn an innocent to death who had been wrongly accused of heresy was something nobody wanted to have on their conscience, because that would then indict them to hell for murder. So the Catholic Church was not this rampaging cauldron of fanaticism that the rationalist revisionists have made out. Quite the opposite. They had quite a tight system going on. But there were, however, many more instances of vigilante lynch mob activity going on that led to a large multitude of the deaths that we hear about, and they were committed largely not by Catholics but by Protestant reformers who took up the mantle of judge, jury, and executioner independently, and carried on by their own moral righteousness, took it upon themselves to identify and punish heretics in a much more sloppy and unsophisticated system. So when we think of historical events like the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials, and draw upon that associated imagery that renders those times in a highly zealous and fanatical light, we have to understand that whilst there is a strong element of truth to that, we still have to be fair in our analysis and understand that it was mostly independent, self-appointed religious mobs that contributed to the bulk of the heretical executions, and the reigning power structure of the Catholic Church, contrary to popular opinion, was very stringent in the way that they processed potential heretics. Nonetheless, we are now starting to see how the proliferation of heresy was tied to the expansion of the reform initiatives that were going on. And common to these types of Puritan initiatives, they were becoming galvanized by their own hubris and take on life of their own, and they took on a kind of life on their own is what I mean, at which point it's very difficult to rein in the momentum of what's already begun, even when that initiative concludes to some quite dark destinations. With its connection to heresy, witchcraft started to take on some new attributions that added to the older ones, such as the orgiastic feast, secret seances, cannibalism, the open renunciation of God, and the desecration of holy objects and other blasphemic expressions. The socio-psychological disequilibrium that was produced from the unraveling of the social programs produced an inner turmoil that led not only to the growth and the enlargement, the expansion of the definition of heresy, but also the intolerance and the severe punishment of it as well. The fact that the Christian church represented both the spiritual and the political power centres in Europe is also significant here. The Christian project was aiming to redefine society in its own image. So this was not merely a spiritual problem, this was also a socio-political one, and witchcraft, by that logic, represented not only a form of religious heresy, but also a defiance towards the social idealism that the Christians were trying to capture in their own world. And that is the central defining characteristic of medieval witchcraft in the eyes of Christianity. The defiance of God and society at large on behalf of the powers of evil. So I want to start drawing things together a bit now and talk about the implications that this study of witchcraft and heresy can tell us about things that are sensitive to us today in the modern world. I really wanted this treatment to be more of a primer into the subject of medieval witchcraft, and also see if we could cut through a lot of the distortion around the subject that's been created by revisionism and romantics. There is obviously much more detail that could be gone into regarding this subject, but I think that we've gone over pretty much all of the essential elements that are necessary to form a clear first impression of the subject of witchcraft and its surrounding history. There are good books out there on the subject, but unfortunately they are buried under a mountain of lesser works, which means that you really have to use your own intuition and instincts and search for them. Look for some good reviews on Amazon as well. But I will say that if you're going to buy one book on the subject of witchcraft, I'd say go for Witchcraft in the Middle Ages by Geoffrey Burton Russell. This is highly interesting and thorough and doesn't contain any new age drivel or post-enlightenment nonsense in there at all. This is one of the most interesting books that I've read all year, actually, and this video wouldn't have been so well informed if it wasn't for this book. So that's that. One of the things, though, I think that makes the medieval witch so interesting as a subject is how its history speaks on so many levels to the kind of psychological hysteria and socio-political demonization that still very readily go on today. The biggest pretense of the rationalists is this notion of the history of progress, and that we, by definition of our later time period compared to people in the Middle Ages when witchcraft and the Inquisition occurred, are in some way more rational, more reasonable, and less likely somehow to fall into the odious patterns of superstition and fanaticism as they were. Thank goodness we have moved on since then, the contemporary man will say, without even thinking to address the underlying substructures that provoke this kind of reaction to occur. The witch is a shadow archetype of the unwanted, ostracized, and uncomfortable expressions that for one reason or another cannot be successfully integrated into the body corpus of mainstream society. And so they germinate out on the fringes of society, in the secret underworld of private practices where their patterns won't be so easily detected by the judgmental eyes of the orthodoxy in charge. And you can extend this to so many expressions today that are considered fringe or controversial in some way to the mainstream view of things. I'm not trying to invoke any sympathy for these systems of thought just because they are fringe or looked down upon. What I am trying to say is that fringe ideas and practices always exist, regardless of the time scale, and that the mainstream relationship to those expressions is a negotiation in process that hinges on the level of stability of the society at large. As we said earlier, there is an umbilical link between the mind of man and society, and as society internally destabilizes for whatever reason, it creates an insecurity within the psychological system that is felt at all levels of the society. And the orthodox relationship to fringe expressions changes and it usually mutates into a more toughened stance, a more serious stance towards them, yeah? You can swap out the witch and put in its place any contemporary expression that belongs to a set of ideas that are considered anathema to the mainstream perspective of the world, and which are, in their own expression, defiant towards the reigning superstructures of the day. And like we've said, the relationship that the mainstream has towards these fringe perspectives changes as the mainstream hold on society is disturbed or is similarly impoverished due to some other consequence. The same patterns always emerge in human history. The mainstream orthodoxy that gets set in place has the power to define society in its own image and naturally makes changes to that society. Those changes often carry consequences that alter society in unexpected ways, and this in turn contributes to a deforming of the organic equilibrium of a society, which then, as a reaction to this, makes the state double down on its own dogma and punish those who hold dissenting views as a way of attempting to stabilize a situation that they destabilized because of their own policy. Now, I'm not saying that fringe views are always right by merit of the fact that they're fringe, or that the changes made to a society at the hands of the elite are always bad, because they're not. What I am saying is that humans respond to situations in very predictable ways. And when a society migrates into a phase of instability and problems emerge, that is when the phenomena of heresy becomes a much more prominent feature within the social consciousness. And this doesn't have to have anything to do with religion at all. You can have political heresies, academic heresies, cultural creative heresies, anywhere where there is a hierarchy of ideas and an oligarchy and a set of fringe values that lie around it, you can see similar patterns of action occur, and human history is replete with the instances that prove that. Even the words heretic and witch hunt have a wider general application. Humans are intuitively aware that there is a power within words, and many of us come to this understanding directly from the fact that words affect us. Words are spoken in a particular way, and they hold a certain power over us. And so when it comes to looking at patterns of demonizations and accusations of heresy in society, and the moral righteousness that kind of goes along with it, all of the hubris and the hysteria, this awareness of the power and effect of our language can come front and center. So when the accumulated atmosphere in a human collective reaches a certain point, there comes a point of crisis where we develop outlets for that neurotic anxiety, that power to kind of discharge itself. This does not in any way remedy the actual instigating problems that are contributing to the accumulation of this shared neurosis, but it does go some way of realizing releasing, should I say, some of the existential anxiety that comes along with it. And it also conveniently absolves us from the responsibility of facing up to the possibility that the ideas that we align to might have been the cause for a lot of the discontent in the first place. We double down, we entrench ourselves within our own dogma, and righteously accuse others of being the root of all society's ills, when in fact we share a portion of the responsibility for why things had gone awry. And the heretic comes into play then because he or she provides us with that outlet that we can offload our existential anxieties onto and start a crusade of righteous suppression and punishment against them. And we see that today in our times, how words like hateful, racist, or Nazi have had the boundaries of their original definitions expanded and now encompass many different ideas or behaviours that are critical of subjects that are sensitive to orthodox opinion and their policies. These words are simply modern day words for heretic. And the modern establishment that occupies the present power structures loves to rile people up through the media into a hysteria against people who hold to anti-establishment views. So I don't think that we can really take the rationalists very seriously then when they make the claim that we are in some way more sophisticated than our medieval ancestors. In fact, when we understand how to identify and look for these psychological and social patterns properly, we can see them quite clearly in our time. So I think I'm going to draw this to a close. This was a two-part series, and I wanted to keep this limited to the most essential information possible. And I think that we've done quite a successful job in both unpacking the identity of the European witch and the practice of witchcraft, and understanding a lot of the surrounding circumstances that led to its ascent and suppression, and what that really says to us in our times today. So yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed this two-part series. I hope you have a good time tonight, whatever you're doing for Halloween, and as usual, I'll see you again.